Hebrews 10 verse 36b. Doing the will of God, receiving the promise, the interval of grace, so that, when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. There is always a space between believing and beholding, between beginning and inheriting, between the first taste of grace and the full possession of glory. Hebrews does not hide that space. It names it. It sanctifies it. It explains it. You have need of endurance so that, when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. There is a divine logic here. The promise is certain. The inheritance is real. But it is not placed in the believer's hands at conversion like a prize handed out before the race begins. There is an interval, appointed, measured, purposeful, and that interval is not empty. It is the arena where obedience and endurance quietly shape the soul for glory. Hebrews 10 verse 36b teaches that persevering obedience, doing the revealed will of God through the appointed interval, is the graciously ordained path by which believers come into the actual possession of the promised inheritance, not as merit earned, but as promise fulfilled. First, the purpose clause. Endurance is going somewhere. The verse opens with purpose, hina, so that. The Christian life is not circular. It is directional. Endurance is not spiritual survival for its own sake. It has a destination. You have need of endurance, the writer has said, so that you may receive. The verb earlier in the verse is hupomonei, endurance, remaining under. It is not passive resignation, but steadfast continuance. And here we see why. Endurance bridges obedience and inheritance. It spans the distance between present fidelity and future fulfillment. The readers had suffered. They had borne reproach. They had endured confiscation of property, but they had not yet received the final inheritance. The promise stood before them, not yet in their grasp. And that is always the temptation of the interval, to step off the road before the horizon comes into view. Hebrews answers that temptation by showing that endurance is not static. It is moving somewhere. It is aimed at something. It is tethered to promise. Second, having done the will of God, obedience in two directions. The phrase is weighty, having done the will of God. In Greek, it reads, poiasantis to the lema tu teu, having done the will of God. This is not God's hidden decree. It is his revealed will, the path set before his covenant people. And in Hebrews, that will has a twofold shape. First, active obedience, holding fast the confession, drawing near with a true heart, loving the brethren, refusing to forsake the assembling, bearing reproach with Christ, continuing allegiance to the Son when retreat would be easier. Second, patient submission. The will of God includes not only what we do, but what we endure. It includes trusting his timing, waiting through silence, accepting delay without accusation. Obedience here is not spasmodic effort. It is sustained posture. This guards us from two errors. It guards against legalism, because Christ has already done the decisive will of God in offering himself once for all. Hebrews 10 verses 7 to 10. Our obedience does not supplement his sacrifice, but it also guards against passivity. Doing the will of God is not spiritual idleness. It is not resting in grace without movement. It is the steady pattern of a life aligned with what God has revealed. Faith is not merely believing a promise once. It is living in alignment with that promise over time. Third, you may receive the promise, grace possessed. The goal is clear. You may receive what was promised. The verb is kamisesta, to receive, to obtain, to carry off as one's own. It implies actual possession, not abstract awareness. And what is the promise? In Hebrews, the promise is not vague blessing. It is the inheritance secured by Christ's priesthood, eternal rest, the unshakable kingdom, the better and abiding possession once glimpsed when they accepted the plundering of their goods. It is salvation brought to completion. But notice the precision of the text. It does not say you earn the promise. It says you receive it. Promise and merit do not mix. What is promised is of grace. It is secured entirely by Christ. Yet it is received along a path, a life shaped by endurance and obedience. This is the tension Hebrews refuses to flatten. The inheritance is wholly gracious. The path to it is persevering faith. God ordains not only the end, the promised inheritance, but the means, endurance, obedience, patient waiting. Abraham believed. Abraham obeyed. Abraham waited. And after patient endurance, he obtained the promise, not because he purchased it, but because he walked the appointed road. So too here, the interval between promise given and promise possessed is not wasted time. It is shaping time, proving time, training time. It is grace preparing the soul for glory. Reflections for today, living inside the interval. First, this verse reframes seasons of delay. Many believers quietly struggle with what feels like divine silence, prayers that linger unanswered, growth that feels imperceptible, circumstances that refuse to resolve. Modern culture interprets delay as dysfunction. Hebrews interprets it as design. The interval is not abandonment. It is formation. The slowness that unsettles you may be the very means by which God deepens your endurance and disentangles your heart from lesser hopes. Second, this text confronts our tendency toward bursts of enthusiasm without sustained obedience. It is possible to surge in moments of crisis and then grow dull in ordinary days. But having done the will of God describes a course, not a spike. The question is not whether there were seasons of visible zeal in your past, but whether there is present, persevering alignment with Christ now. Has obedience become selective? Has patience thinned? The will of God is walked more often in quiet fidelity than in dramatic moments. Third, this promise exposes how easily temporary comforts regain their weight. The readers once accepted the loss of property because they knew they had a better possession. Yet over time, what is visible can begin to feel more substantial than what is promised. When earthly stability feels more urgent than eternal inheritance, endurance weakens. The soul begins negotiating with shadows. But when the promise regains its gravity, when the unshakable kingdom becomes more real than shifting comforts, obedience steadies and waiting softens. Conclusion: the road leads somewhere. Hebrews 10 verse 36b does not flatter. It does not rush. It does not promise immediate resolution. It says there is a will to be done. There is an interval to be walked. There is a promise to be received. Christ has fulfilled the decisive will of God. He has secured the inheritance by his blood. Now he calls his people to remain steadily, faithfully, until faith becomes sight. Victory is not handed out at the starting line. It is placed in the hands of those who, kept by grace, remain on the road. So remain. Keep doing the will of God. The promise is not a mirage. It waits, real, weighty, and nearer than you think. Amen.